Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our program, A Greek Odyssey, Athens, Delphi, Crete, and a FulBright Fellow. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Cary Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like today's event to you. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please submit them to the Q&A or chat, and Bruce will answer them at the end of the program. Tonight, we welcome back our speaker, Bruce Magnuson. Bruce has presented a couple of programs for us in the past, and they are available for you to view on our YouTube channel. I'll add those links into the chat so you can view them whenever you get a chance. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. After retiring from a career in financial services, Bruce pursued his interests in photography, art, and history. He has had photographs in multiple shows at the Griffin Museum in Winchester and various other venues, including a solo show featuring his infrared photographs at the Acton Library. Bruce has studied at the New England School of Photography, the Griffin Museum, the De Cordova Museum, the Art Institute of Boston, and Maine Media, among other visual arts programs. He presents at various organizations on topics that feature his photography and explores subjects such as art, history, and travel, including the history of his home region, the Hudson Valley. Welcome back, Bruce. It's so nice to see you again.
Great. Thanks, Helen. Thanks to you and to the Cary Library for sponsoring this intro page, and we'll hop into the agenda. So we'll start off with an introduction. We'll take a little tour into periods of ancient Greece, and I will say we're covering about 4,500 years of history, so we're not going to get too in-depth into this, but a lot of this does impact what you see today. We'll take a look at modern Greece, which is the part that probably a lot of folks aren't familiar with. I certainly wasn't. We'll dive into Athens, take a look at Delphi, go to Crete, the island of Crete, circle back to Athens, and then we'll talk briefly about the FulBright, which is kind of the reason all this travel happened. My daughter was a FulBright Fellow for a year in Greece, July of 2022, August of 2022 to July of 2023. And so my wife and I actually took two separate trips over to Greece. So as an introduction, you can't go too far in Greece without seeing the Greek flag waving somewhere. Very, very dynamic. And this is what it represents. Of course, it's the blue and the white. The 9 stripes are the 9 syllables, which I will not attempt to pronounce in Greece, which means freedom or death. The cross, the white cross, is the Greek Orthodox Church, which about 90% plus of folks in Greece are members of the Greek Orthodox. Blue background stands for truth, loyalty, and justice, as well as the color of the Aegean Sea. And the white is peace and honesty, and it's also the color of the waves that crest on the Aegean Sea. So just as kind of everybody on the same page, geographically, this is what we're talking about as far as Greece here at the tip of Europe, sticking out into this is the Aegean Sea here on the left, and then we have the Adriatic going up here on the right. Obviously the Mediterranean, this is Crete. A little closer look at it, you see it really does take into account most of the Aegean. Most of the islands are Greek. Of course, there's been a lot of conflict between Greeks and Turkey over the years. We'll get into that a little bit when we get into the Greek history. Athens here is at the end of this. This is actually the Peloponnesian Peninsula, where Sparta was located. And so this is pretty much what we're talking about, and Crete is where we end up. This is the largest island at the south part of the Aegean Sea. So periods of ancient Greece. And as far as the questions asked, you want to pop questions in as they come along, because we are going to jump around a lot of different subjects. So it may make sense to answer them as we talk about particular subjects. So if you want to pop them into the Q&A or the chat, I'll take a look at as I go from one section to the next. So this is kind of gives you the breadth of what we're talking about as far as Greek history, going to the Cycladic era back to around 3200 BC, and then going up to the modern era when Greece becomes a separate country in 1821 when it separates from the Ottoman Empire. So it's kind of interesting to look at it because, what we consider, ancient Greece to us is the classical period here is actually only about 170 years. So you see in this whole continuum of Greek history, the part that I think most people are familiar with Socrates and Plato, Aristotle, all that kind of good stuff. really only happens, and actually the Parthenon itself was constructed in around 475, I think, BC. So it falls within this really, really narrow window, but there's a lot of stuff going on in the Grecian peninsula from the Cycladic, which is these are the islands here, the Cyclades, which because they kind of form a circle is how they get their name. The Minoan civilization that is basically based here in Crete. So when we visit Crete, we'll talk about the Minoan civilization. The Mycenaean civilization, which is kind of here. This is basically where the Trojan War comes into play. So a lot of the myth, Homer, Iliad, the Odyssey, all that's based on the Mycenaean. And then you transition from the Archaic into the Classic. You have the Hellenistic, which is basically Alexander the Great. And then you go to Roman as Roman takes over from Greece as the dominating uh, army and culture here in the Mediterranean, end up transition to the Byzantine Empire, and finally the Ottoman Empire. And as I said, in 1821, Greek does get its independence. So, famous quote that gets used a lot these days from our friend William Faulkner: "The past is not dead, it is not even past." And certainly no other place than Greece is this more true. So everywhere you look in Greece, you are going to be referenced back to these things that are millennia in the past, and they are everywhere. And the most dominating is the Acropolis and the Parthenon, which when you get to Athens, is just so amazing because it literally is right in the middle on this hill slash mountain, and you can see it from everywhere. So it is there, 7 by 24. Since I've spent a lot of time in Greece, relatively speaking, we had to spend about 3 weeks there over the course of about 6 months. We delved into some rather deeper type of things that, and one of them was the Museum of Cycladic Art, which this does go back, I said, to like 3200 BC. So this is, 5,000 years ago, and you see some of the artifacts that were made there. And this is just kind of a tangent. It's an amazing museum. I said, once again, it's, not one of the top three you'd probably go to if you only have a couple of days to spend in Athens, but if you have some more time to delve into it deeper, this is just a gem of a museum in Athens. So some more detail, the timelines. You have the Great Minoan civilization here, which is on Crete. The Trojan War and the destruction of Troy is around 1200 BC. You have the actual development of the first Greek alphabet, which is around 800 BC. And that's interesting in the fact that, of course, the Iliad and the Odyssey were basically an oral tradition and didn't get written down until there was actually an alphabet to write them into around 800. So around 800 BC is when you see the actual Iliad and the Odyssey being written down, but the stories have been passed down generations and generations from previously to that. The famous Persian Wars begin around 490 BCE. You have the Peloponnesian War, which is the war between Athens and Sparta, which kind of blows up Athens as a dominant player in that area. It does become a very, very successful city-state, as most of these, all these places were city-states. Same thing in the Italian peninsula. So they're relatively small as far as governing bodies and stuff like that goes, but that's how it was basically articulated back in those days. Alexander the Great from Macedonia, he dies in 323 BC. And then ultimately, one of his offspring, one of his relatives, might have been his nephew, ends up losing to Rome at this battle, and that pretty much is the end of Greece as a major influence in the area. So the National Archaeological Museum, this is the major museum that displays a lot of these artifacts that have been discovered throughout the Grecian peninsula. And the one that we see here is called the Mask of Agamemnon. And this is basically the Mona Lisa of ancient Greece. And if you're familiar with archaeology, the archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann, who is famous for discovering the city of Troy over in Anatolia, he actually, before Troy, does do excavations in Greece and finds a lot of these artifacts. Now, he just jumps right to it, finds a mask, looks like it's kind of an important guy. So he says, oh, this must be the mask of Agamemnon. Of course, Agamemnon, one of the big characters in the Iliad. They do some carbon dating later on and find out that this would not have been at the time that Agamemnon was supposed to have actually lived. But if nothing else, Heinrich Schliemann was also a showman. So, and we'll get into this in the Palace of Knossos, the architectural techniques that were done here in the 1800s and the early 1900s, which certainly make the archaeologists of today cringe. But as you can see, you've got a lot of people. As you walk into the museum, this is really what is in display. And I highly recommend the National Archaeological Museum. This is They're not quite sure exactly who this is, whether it's Poseidon or whether it's Zeus, either throwing a trident or throwing lightning bolts. But the museum is just chock full of this stuff, and it's really deep into Athens. It's not really near the Parthenon, but it is certainly something that you want to check out to get a sense of really the whole continuum of this, history that I articulated, where you had this, thousands and thousands of years, not just this 170-year thing that we consider of classical Greece. So it's no surprise, I think, to folks that, Greek influence, obviously they're a baseline for Western civilization with regard to philosophy, drama, politics, mathematics, all kinds of science. Actually, the New Testament is written in Greek. And so the Airbnb we were staying at overlooked this, which is Mars Hill, which is actually in the foreground. This obviously is the Acropolis with the Parthenon. We can't see the Parthenon. This is the Polypaleia, which is the entrance in to the Acropolis, and the Parthenon is kind of behind it. But this is actually a very, very important hill in the history of Christianity, as the Apostle Paul did a lot of his preaching in this area. So a lot of the books in the New Testament, Corinthians, Ephesians, these are all cities in the area that he is writing letters to. Corinthian is Corinth, Ephesian is Ephesus. These are all things that are relatively close to Athens. So he's very much in this space, and this Mars Hill is one of the places that he was noted for preaching. And of course, Greek mythology is just really kind of endemic in our culture with, the name of the constellations, certainly even the U.S. space program. It's become kind of a resurgence with current popular literature. If you notice, a lot of bestsellers recently are actually going back to the myths of Greece, and then a lot of it to the Iliad and the Odyssey. You don't have to go too far to see something referencing the Iliad and the Odyssey. I think there's a new movie out that Ralph Fiennes is in, and Juliette Binoche. They were in The English Patient. Well, they're in a new motion picture just coming out this month, which is basically about Odysseus and Penelope in the Odyssey. There's just no shortage of that, even in the theater. One of the best plays or best musicals that was on Broadway a few years ago is Hadestown, which once again references to Greek mythology. So since Greek is so endemic, I thought this is kind of an interesting little blurb that does kind of give you a perspective. We think about Athens as the progenitor of democracy, which is true. When you think about Socrates as being kind of one of the great philosophers of the classical Greek tradition, which is also true. But he didn't think that much of democracy. So it's kind of an interesting little juxtaposition here of about a 4-minute video.
Hello, I'm Jimmy Kimmel, and welcome to Can You Give It?
We're used to thinking very highly of democracy, and by extension of ancient Athens, the civilization that gave rise to it. The Parthenon has become almost a byword for democratic values, which is why so many leaders of democracies like to be photographed there. It's therefore very striking to discover that one of ancient Greece's greatest achievements, philosophy, was highly suspicious of its other achievement, democracy. The founding father of Greek philosophy, Socrates, is portrayed in the dialogues of Plato as hugely pessimistic about the whole business of democracy. In Book 6 of the Republic, Plato describes Socrates falling into conversation with a character called Adimantus and trying to get him to see the flaws of democracy by comparing a society to a ship. If you were heading out on a journey by sea, asks Socrates, who would you ideally want deciding who was in charge of the vessel? Just anyone, or people educated in the rules and demands of seafaring? The latter, of course, says Adimantus. So why then, responds Socrates, do we keep thinking that any old person should be fit to judge who should be the ruler of a country? Socrates' point is that voting in an election is a skill, not a random intuition. And like any skill, it needs to be taught systematically to people. Letting the citizenry vote without an education is as irresponsible as putting them in charge of a trireme sailing to Samos in a storm. Socrates was to have first-hand catastrophic experience of the foolishness of voters. In 399 BC, the philosopher was put on trial on trumped-up charges of corrupting the youth of Athens. A jury of 500 Athenians was invited to weigh up the case and decided by a narrow margin that the philosopher was guilty. He was put to death by hemlock in a process which is, for thinking people, every bit as tragic as Jesus' condemnation has been for Christians. Crucially, Socrates was not elitist in the normal sense. He didn't believe that a narrow few should only ever vote. He did, however, insist that only those who had thought about issues rationally and deeply should be let near a vote. We have forgotten this distinction between an intellectual democracy and a democracy by birthright. We have given the vote to all without connecting it to wisdom. And Socrates knew exactly where that would lead, to a system the Greeks feared above all, demagoguery. Ancient Athens had painful experience of demagogues. For example, the louche figure of Alcibiades, a rich, charismatic, smooth-talking, wealthy man who eroded basic freedoms and helped to push Athens to its disastrous military adventures in Sicily. Socrates knew how easily people seeking election could exploit our desire for easy answers. He asked us to imagine an election debate between two candidates, one who was like a doctor and the other who was like a sweet shop owner. The sweet shop owner would say of his rival, "Look, this person here has worked many evils on you. He hurts you, gives you bitter potions, and tells you not to eat and drink whatever you like. He'll never serve you feasts of many and varied pleasant things like I will." Socrates asks us to consider the audience's response. Do you think the doctor would be able to reply effectively? The true answer, "I cause you trouble and go against your desires in order to help you," would cause an uproar among the voters, don't you think? We have forgotten all about Socrates' salient warnings against democracy. We have preferred to think of democracy as an unambiguous good rather than as something that is only ever as effective as the education system that surrounds it. As a result, we have elected many sweet shop owners and very few doctors.
Okay, I promise that's the last philosophy we'll get into, but it's interesting. And once again, going into the kind of original source material with all this Greek philosophy, plays, or not that many plays that survive, but the ones that do are incredibly foundational to what we are doing today. And it's interesting to go back and look at what they're actually saying, because obviously in the millennia since then, a lot of the messages kind of get simplified. And this is one thing the founding fathers were very, very attuned to. They did a tremendous amount of reading about the ancients and what they were doing, and realized that it was much more complex than, like this video said, like, democracy just by and large is good, and there's, no other kind of caveats around it. So with that, we will jump into modern Greece. And like I said before, modern Greece becomes a separate country not until 1821. So basically, after the Roman Empire takes over around the turn of the millennia, you don't have a separate Greek country for like 1800 years, which is kind of amazing. And so they are part of the Ottoman Empire, which is a lot of the tensions they have currently today with the Turks. There was a very, very difficult relationship for the 400 years or so that the Greeks were under the Ottomans. And they wage a war of independence from 1821 to 1830, and they create a Greek state. And then they have this exchange of populations in the 1920s, 1923. If you're familiar with the history of India, it's kind of similar to that. When India is split in 1947 after World War II, when the British Raj exits, and you have this Pakistan, East Pakistan and India, there's this whole transition of populations of people who are, seeing where they're going to be, and they're not going to be in an area that's aligned with their historical antecedents. They're going to try and move, and it gets incredibly bloody, incredibly tragic. And you have a similar type of thing that happens with Greeks and Turks in 1923 after World War II, as the Ottoman Empire fully dissolves after the war, because they were on the losing side with Germany and the Austria-Hungary Empire. And they had this switch of 1 million Greeks and 500,000 Turks, and incredibly disruptive and incredibly bloody. Then you have, and this becomes germane to my trip, we have the military junta, which comes into play from 1967 to 1974. You also have the modern Olympics. They get regenerated in 1896 in Athens. They have a civil war after World War II. Then they go into kind of a period of calm, per se, and they become a member of the EU, actually, the European Community, actually, which is a precursor to the EU. So in 1981, they become a member of that, and then 2001, they do become a member in the Eurozone, which means they adopt the euro. They host the Olympics in 2004. They wanted to get it in 1996. but they really, quite frankly, couldn't get it together for that. So they hosted in 2004, and I'll show you some things that actually has a lot to do with the modern Athens that we see today. That impacts the city a lot, and at least from a tourist perspective, very positively. They have a tremendous debt crisis as part of the Eurozone in 2009 to 2018. And then my family visits in 2022 to 2023. So it is a very, very dynamic, you think about these countries, you think about Greece, and you think about it's been around for millennia and all that stuff, and it'll be this stable country that's kind of always been there and things along those lines. And that is absolutely not the case. It's been a very, very dynamic and upheaval history in the last 150 years or so. So this kind of sets the stage as to how Greece is an important part in the Cold War. So in this map, you see green, which represents basically NATO nations. And then here in the kind of salmon color, you have the Warsaw Pact, which are aligned with the Soviet Union. So you see Greece is right in the front lines. Albania and Bulgaria, both the Warsaw Pact. Greece and Turkey are members of NATO. So this plays a lot into the Cold War, where Greece is very important. And from the United States perspective, we are backing Greece because they are not the Warsaw Pact. And a very famous or infamous date is November 17th in 1967. There is a, 1973. There is an uprising of students at the Athens Polytechnic Institute. And, kind of a Kent State thing, although it's much bloodier. And it's a popular uprising. There is this military junta, which is backed by the U.S. It's a conglomeration of, I think, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 colonels from the Greek army, and they are ruling the nation. There's this rebellion from the students. There is a violent suppression to put it down. Dozens are killed. Like I said, the United States backs the junta. So what that means to me is when our first trip, the day we get to Athens is November 16th. And so our first full day is November 17th. And so my daughter is living in the suburbs of Athens, and we're staying right downtown. Basically, the balcony from our Airbnb can see the Acropolis. So her classes, her school is closed. She's in this private secondary school that has students from all over Athens. They have a bus service that has to go over Athens. So there's going to be a tremendous amount of protests in memory of this day. And it's not a very favorable protest for the United States. So basically it said if you're United States citizen, you want to hang low. And so she's saying we need to get to her apartment early in the morning before everything starts kicking up. And they do stop some of the subway stops that go through Syntagma Square, which is the main square. They have these protests. And obviously we just landed, getting up early in the morning wasn't necessarily number one on our agenda, but we did get out there. We did see a helicopter throughout the whole day. There was a helicopter hovering around the center of the city. We didn't see any of the protests. But we read the news afterwards, and there were over 5,000 police were deployed to basically stem the protests there. So it was an interesting example. This is the farthest I've been from the United States. And this was the first place where I was kind of like, and so we were there at the end of November or middle of November. So there weren't a lot of tourists. We were on top of the Acropolis. English was not spoken at all, really. There weren't a lot of tourists walking around. That said, it's a great time to visit because the weather is phenomenal. It's cool, sunny. You don't have the brutal heat you have in the summer, but it was a day to kind of say we were Canadian. So this is Syntagma Square, where a lot of the protests happen. They do have a change in the guard. They have these very elaborate soldiers here who guard the palace, and they have I think it's 11 a.m. on Sundays during the off seasons when they have a elaborate changing of the guard. And as I mentioned, Greece is part of the EU, and so it's the Schengen area, which is the travel where you don't need passports if you're a member of Schengen, and they're a member of that, and they're also a member of the Eurozone, which is what the euro is based on. So when you go to Greece, there's no more drachma; it is all the euro, and that makes it super easy. We had one of our trips. We actually went to Italy after we went to Greece, and there's no need to change money because as you go from Greece to Italy, they're all within the Eurozone. So that makes sense. Obviously, from the financial perspective, there is the southern countries, have a lot of tension with the northern countries in Scandinavia, and there was a lot of debt crisis, and Germany was really putting the screws to Greece, and there's a lot of kind of resentment in that spot, and also a lot of the immigrant, particularly Syria, the Syrian immigrants were coming in, and they were hitting southern Italy or southern Europe, Italy, and Greece, and so you have a lot of challenges, a lot of immigrants coming along on islands and ending up. And so the southern folks were kind of having to bear the brunt of that. So that definitely creates a lot of tension within the EU. From a tourist perspective, I don't think you really see a lot of that, but it is super convenient to not have to change money. So the demographics of Greece has got a population around 10 million. It is slightly declining. About a third to a half of everybody, the population in Greece does live in Athens. One of our taxi drivers was talking about, he was a younger kid, he'd gone to university, probably in his mid-20s, and he was saying how frustrating it was because everything happens in Athens. If you're not in Athens for the most part, Thessaloniki, which is in the north, is kind of the second city of Greece. It's a big student city, but you can see by the demographics here that most of everything is really concentrated in Athens. So that makes challenging for a lot of the outlying areas in Greece. They're very, very sparsely populated. Once you get outside Athens proper, the population and the housing goes down very, very dramatically. It's about 51,000 square miles, which is about the size of Alabama. I mentioned before, 90+% do identify as Greek Orthodox, and it is a service-based economy, as you see here with the blue. I was telling Helen beforehand, because it's a service-based economy, people ask, well, is it hard because you don't speak Greek? And of course, the truth is not many people in the world do speak Greek, and the Greeks know that. So from, the service economy being a large part of their economic wherewithal, they are very, very amenable to the fact that a lot of the tourists, English, for better or for worse, is kind of the basic language that most people have some sort of understanding with. And so, particularly in Athens, anybody speaking English is, not an issue. No problem with that. Obviously, the alphabet is totally different. So that becomes a challenge if you don't have anything that doesn't have me translated into English. You think like Google Translate can help you, and I'll show that later in the presentation, but in general, not a problem. Not speaking Greek. So with that said, we'll jump into Athens. This is this bizarre sculpture of the goddess Athena, which is in a sculpture park in the center of Athens. Once again, it's kind of off the beaten path, but we had some extra time and went there. It's this fascinating sculpture of all kinds of heroes and people in modern Greece history. And this is the goddess of Athena. Once again, back from a geography perspective, here we are at the tip here in Athens. This is Piraeus, which is the port. So if you do go by boat to Athens, you go to Piraeus and then disembark and go up here into Athens. There's actually a tram that goes here. If you take any of the ferries that go out to the islands, most of them leave from Piraeus. Piraeus is very much a working port, very hard scrabble port area. And Athens is further inland from here and has the Acropolis. So this is what you're going to see when you see pretty much, 90+% of the apartments that are in Athens. It is a sea of, white and off-white. This is actually in the Grecian agora or agora, depending upon how you pronounce it. So you had this, ancient temple here, and just within here you had this sea of all of this apartment buildings. This is kind of what you're looking at. Is they all have awnings. They're made of kind of like, I don't know, stucco, for lack of a better term, cement. Not in great shape necessarily. They all do, have a lot of foliage outside. Everybody has their little verandas with all kinds of plants. And so the story is that after World War II and after the Civil War, basically Athens was not a very big city. So once again, you think these cities have been populated, for millennia and just continue to grow, and they didn't. And Athens, kind of Rome, has a similar story where the population went down quite low. And it comes back up. And so after World War II, it's coming back up again. And what they do is they give people who own land the rights to build these like 4 to 5 story apartment buildings where they get to have one for their own domicile, and then they can rent the other ones out. And so you see that all throughout. And as you come in from the airport's quite a bit a ways out. So as you drive in, you get a really good sense of all this. You can see in the valley here that it just spreads all over the place. And it's after a while they have these a lot of flowering citrus trees. Some of them you can't eat, that's a bitter orange, but some of them do have lemons that you can eat and stuff like that. And it's quite charming for a Mediterranean climate. Like I said, I was not there in the summer. From what people have told me, my daughter included, charm is not necessarily the word you would use. It's 105 degrees there, but for a lot of 8 months of the year, it is actually beautiful, and you have a lot of this kind of topiary stuff that's in the apartment buildings. So this is downtown Athens proper. This is the Acropolis, which is kind of the centering point. This is Plaka, which is the old town, the original settlement. We stayed over here in Theseo, and there's this pedestrian walkway which was created during for the Olympics in 2004. I will say that pedestrian is a loose term in Athens. There were a lot of motorbikes on this place, but there were no real cars per se. So it's a beautiful, beautiful walking area, and it's all pretty, tightly a distance here. You have Monastiraki Square, which is one of the famous old time squares, an old monastery there, hence the name. This is Pasiri, which is a very, very quaint area. Tons of restaurants. Restaurant Row is kind of here in Monastiraki. You have the city center where that's Syntagma Square is right on the edge of that. You have a national garden. It's just a beautiful city. It's a beautiful walking city. And we did use the subway. We'll get to that. But a lot of what we did was walking. And like I said, the weather was phenomenal. So the subway did get quite a boost from the Olympics. So in the Olympics in 2004, I believe the green line here, which is line number 1, that's the original subway. And everything else was built for the 2004 Olympics. So this is old and rickety. I mean, there's no two ways about it. So we were staying here at the CO. So we did have to ride this for a bit. The blue line in particular goes out to the airport, is brand new. The stations are brand new. Actually, some of the stations, when they were building the stations and digging down, they actually came to some archaeological remnants, and those are actually, you can see them in the station. They kept them intact, and so it's pretty wild. And it's amazing. It's quick. It's cheap. I forget how much it was. I want to say it was maybe €2. But it was good, very good transportation, particularly the newer lines. So there's no doubt that there was a major upgrade in public transportation in Athens after the Olympics. And one thing, I had heard about Athens over the years was that it was a dirty, smelly place and hot to visit. In the summer, I'm sure it is hot, but I didn't find it that dirty. Didn't really find it that smelly. It is a congested place, but I think the subways really have alleviated a lot of that in the last 20 years, because those are much more efficient. So people kind of got away from the cars, less with the cars, and are using more public transportation. So I did not. It's far cleaner than in Boston and certainly in New York. They do have a lot of graffiti, and this is true for a lot of European cities, and it's no shortage of it. Some of it does kind of go toward art. But this one here is actually the person knows what they're doing. This one I found kind of interesting since I grew up in New York. I found that it was interesting. Something I love New York button on some sort of eagle with a bandage on his nose. But you do see an awful lot of graffiti throughout Athens. So the main drag, the main thing to see is the Acropolis and the Parthenon. So it's built between 470 and 438 BC, which is, as I mentioned before, the classical period of Greece. And, since we've been there, they've had to close it down in the summer. Certain days it gets so hot, and they close it between like 10 and 2 or something. And also, they have started to limit the number of tickets they sell. So when we were there, like I said, I was there in mid to late November, and then we were there in mid-April. And it did get pretty busy in April. I said from our Airbnb, I could actually see the line going up to the Parthenon. So we could actually target when we went by seeing what times the line went down. It was very obvious that late in the afternoon, the line was non-existent. So either go relatively early in the morning or you go relatively late in the afternoon. I will say that this is true for a lot of you see in Europe. This is actually very smooth, although it's on an angle. These places are not really ADA compliant. So we'll see some of the shots from the Parthenon. It is a bit of a moonscape. There's no doubt that there's some rough terrain up there. And Greece is a very harsh environment. I mean, it's very dry, very rugged. We'll see this when we go out to Delphi. Very, very mountainous, amazing landscape, but it is very, very rugged. So this is Nix Hill, which actually is where democracy started. Democracy means like gathering of people. And so this is actually where the gathering of people would first start in Athens back around, I don't know, 6 to 500 BC. So there is this whole area, it's a bunch of different hills, and it's an amazing space. It's you just walk into it and you wander around. You get these amazing vistas of the Parthenon and of the Acropolis. And there's a Socrates cell here, which is maybe apocryphal, but a lot of the history here is just amazing. And this is an incredible space, incredibly spread out, not a lot of people around. It's an amazing, amazing place to walk around, and you get these incredible views. And just as a quick, everybody should really know what the column tops are: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. The Parthenon is a Doric, which is the earliest style, the most simple style. Ionic has the curlicues, and Corinthian has all of this leaf stuff. So this is kind of how it looked in its heyday, and this is a rendering of the Parthenon. It's painted, it's very, very bright colors. It's quite different than the ruin that we see today, and quite more elaborate. So you see, this is the propylaea, which is the entrance as you come in, and this is right here is the propylaea too. Kind of come in here, and then you can kind of branch out both ways. You go toward the Parthenon, or you go to the Erechtheum, which is over here with the caryatids. So it's quite a complex up there in its heyday. At the time, a lot of this stuff, obviously, all of it's in ruins, and the Parthenon was by far the biggest building. But you still get a sense of what was up there in its heyday. And you'll see a lot of photographs of the Acropolis. It's an amazing, amazing place to photograph. I mean, obviously one of the most iconic locations in Western history. So being there for a number of weeks, I was fortunate that I got in all kinds of weather, all kinds of lighting situations, everything. This is actually the entrance where you get tickets. Like I said, right now, I think you have to buy tickets in advance during the summer, or else you won't be able to get up there. But when you're there, you can just walk up. The EU is in a process which I think is going to be never ending. I think it's been going on since the 1980s to restore the Parthenon. And there you can see these white things. These are basically pieces that have been reconstructed, and they found these fragments here. So they're reconstructing it, and they're putting the fragment where it was. So you will have at some point a quasi-full Parthenon. And it is on a hill and overlooks another hill, which is Lycabettus Hill. And we ended up going up Lycabettus as well and get some amazing views of the Acropolis looking back from Lycabettus Hill. This is actually the Parthenon as the sun's beginning to set. This is the end with the Greek flag. And just once again, it's just amazing the amount of remnants that are just kind of laying around here, and these columns and pieces that are just incredible, incredible examples of antiquity. But it is an active work site. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of construction going on. And the EU has invested a lot in this. And so there's a lot going on as they're constructing this. Like I say, it's kind of a job for life if you're, I think, involved in that, both the archaeological and the construction side of things. So it's this is a good view of actually Lycabettus and the Acropolis. This is from that another hill, which is near the park where democracy started. And like I said, you can get some amazing, amazing views. This is looking over, and you get some incredible perspective from Lycabettus Hill and Lycabettus Mountain, and you can see going into Piraeus and into the port off into the sea. So it's an incredible view. Mother Nature is nice with some God rays. You get they light it up at night. So, they certainly are aware of the iconic structure that they have, and they certainly show it off to full effect. You can see even in the morning it's lit up. And we had a rainbow. And these are the caryatids, which we'll see those in the museum. These are replacements because the pollution has worn away a lot of the sculptures there. So they're taking steps to kind of preserve it. And like I said, it is an active construction site, so you do have scaffolding around and things along those lines. And unfortunately, no matter where you go, people will litter. This is on top of the Acropolis as you're looking out over the sea of the apartment buildings that is Greater Athens. And the Acropolis Museum. So the Acropolis Museum was opened in 2009. And this is built on top of a excavated site. So they excavated a site here. Clear my throat. And they wanted to build the museum on top of this site. So what they did is they'd done the excavation, they covered it all in gravel, And then they built these supports, built the museum on top of it, and then uncovered the gravel. So you had this really, museum on top of an archaeological site. It's pretty wild. And it's an incredible museum. These are the actual caryatids, which they've brought into the museum to preserve them. You can see the Acropolis and the Parthenon from the museum. They have a wonderful cafe there. This is one of those bizarre instances where you're like, okay, this guy must be famous, but I don't know who he is. And so just by the boots, my first thought was Gene Simmons of Kiss, but this was one of the shows the power of crowdsourcing. We actually posted these pictures that day and asked anybody, do you know who this person is? And it turns out it is the world-renowned, although I did not know him, fashion designer Rick Owen. And these are actually his boots. You can buy them online for about $2,200 a pair, if you so desire. I don't think they're the best boots to walk around Athens in, but if you're familiar with the whole Elgin marbles and the controversy with Britain, where Lord Elgin back in the early 1800s, when Greece was actually still part of the Ottoman Empire, he gets these marbles off the frieze of the Parthenon, carves them off, brings them back to England, Britain, and sells them to the British Museum, where they're displayed to this day. And so one of the arguments over the centuries has been, they took it to protect it. And, the Greeks don't have any place they could display this. So the Greeks have basically called their bluff. In 2009, when this opened, they put plaster casts in sections where these actually are the Elgin marbles that are in the British Museum. So they have this wonderful, 15-year-old brand new museum that can house these Elgin marbles, and they have space ready for them. So I know there's negotiations going back and forth between Greece and Britain, and it's still an ongoing thing, but they do have the space for them now. And interestingly enough, if you want to see a full-size replica of the Parthenon and you don't want to leave the United States, you can go to Nashville, Tennessee. So Nashville, Tennessee, which is called the Athens of the South, they had an exhibition there, I think the late 1800s. They built a replica of the Parthenon. It became such a huge hit. It was made of very, very short-term material, and it became such a hit, and the Nashvillians loved it so much that they actually basically cast it in cement and have made it a permanent structure here in Nashville. And it's cool. I mean, it was great for us because we were there in October last year, 2023. So we've been to the real Parthenon literally like 4 months before. And so, you can go into it. They have a replica of what the statue of Athena may have looked like. And it was really neat. It's really neat. It's quite a edifice there. I never would have thought that would be in Nashville. Once I learned a little bit more about it, it seemed to make sense. But if you're a Parthenon aficionado, it's definitely something to check out. And as I mentioned before, the Olympics were kind of re-engaged in 1896. The modern Olympic Games that we know today started in 1896 in Athens, and this is the Panathenaic Stadium. It is all marble. The thing, as you can see from this picture here, particularly at the side view of the benches, the whole thing is solid marble. I think it's the only all marble stadium in the world, but it is amazing, and it is right downtown Athens, and you can go to it today. I think they still hold some events there. So pretty incredible. So we will take a trip to Delphi, Omphalos, which means navel of the world. From a geographic perspective, it's northwest of Athens. I don't know, 2.5-hour drive about. It's a location of the Oracle, Pythia. It's near Mount Parnassus. Is a strategic importance since basically it's kind of the center of the ancient world in Greece. Becomes a big issue in the Peloponnesian War, and it's considered in those days the edge of the world. So this is a rendering of what it may have looked like in its heyday. Once again, as we'll see, it's all ruins, but there was all kinds of temples here, and there were priests. There was obviously the Oracle herself, all kinds of stuff. There's a stadium up here at the upper level. A very, very involved place. What's interesting is how remote it is. I mean, we took the bus ride. It's one of those bus rides. I took one of those motor coaches, pretty big bus, and you're in this situation of thank goodness I'm not driving, because you're looking down at some of these road, and you look down and there's literally like a couple of feet, and then you plunge, and this guy's driving this large motor coach. So fortunately he drove it very well. And from a photographic perspective, just amazing landscape. I mean, you have, the play of the clouds, a very, very dramatic landscape here, very arid. Most of the trees you see in Greece are olive trees. It is, kind of a cliche, but it's actually true. Most of the trees are olive trees. So, ooh, so here are the ruins, and as you can see, you look over the valley, and this is just a very, very remote place. And how they built all these structures up there is amazing because it is very steep, very rugged. But this is basically what you have left is you have the base of some of the temples, you have a few of the columns. This is probably the one that has the most structure left, but there isn't really a lot left there. And this is one of they call them treasuries. So most of the major city-states, or all the major city-states, had treasuries where they kept various valuables as they were, giving offerings to the oracle. I mean, the oracle was it was kind of funny because the tour guide Maria, she had us. A lot of people had basically characters they were playing. They were given little strips of paper, and they were told in certain reenactments like what to do when things happened in the context of the oracle. And so people would come to the oracle with questions, looking for guidance. And she had some of the guidance. She had like a 2-page thing of the guidance that the oracle gave, and basically it's like Magic 8 Ball. It is very ambiguous. It is not very specific. There's a whole story that there's all kinds of like the reason that it was in Delphi is there's a vent in the earth there, and there are actually, gases coming up. And so the oracle was actually being impacted by the gases. And then they were kind of hallucinating basically. And the priests were the ones who had to take those hallucinations and translate them into quasi-usable stuff that people were looking to get information from. So it's a pretty interesting story. And I said it's an amazingly dramatic landscape. And you can see how you would think this is the edge of the world. On the way, typical bus trip fashion, they try and cram as much as they can into your day. So we stopped in this town called Arahova, which it was amazing, I will say. We spent like an hour there, like an hour and a half at the most. It was just this unbelievably quaint village. And it's actually, I guess there's a ski resort near here. So in the wintertime, there actually is snow in the area and is a ongoing ski resort. But you can see this is the main drag, and this is the street that the bus had to come down, and there's only room for a vehicle going one way. So once again, one of those great things of I'm glad I'm not driving, but it was incredibly quaint. And once again, it's got the dramatic view into the mountains and everything else. We had these red tiled buildings and this kind of aqueduct type thing. Just an incredibly charming place. And once again, we were there in mid November, so it wasn't very crowded. And now we will transition to Crete, which once again, probably not your typical trip when you go to the islands in the Aegean. You had the Santorini, Mykonos, Naxos, these very resort islands. Crete is the largest. But once again, in kind of keeping with the dramatic topography that you've seen in other parts of Greece, this is a very, very rugged island. So it's about, I don't know, like 160 miles across. The one road that goes here from west to east is on the northern part of the island. See here from the topography, these are very, very mountainous. There's some mountains that are over 8,000 feet. We were there in November. Some of them did have snow on them. So it's a rugged place. And this is here is Heracleon, which is the Palace of Knossos, which is the famous Minoan palace, which is one of the must-see things in Crete, probably the must thing to see in Crete. We stayed over here in Hania, which is an unbelievably quaint town. Heracleon is not. So we'll take a quick look at Crete. It's 150 miles long, 30 miles wide. It does have beaches as well as mountains. The Minoan civilization was one of the earliest in Europe. It's a legend of the Labyrinth and the Minotaur. It's where Zorba the Greek, if you're familiar with that book and or a movie, that's where it's based. The English archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans excavates the Palace of Knossos. If you meet Greek people whose last name ends with the suffix "akos," that typically means they're from Crete. That is a thing in Greek culture. And many empires end up ruling it. As you see as you saw on the map, it's really at the base there, the Aegean Sea, hanging out there in the Mediterranean. So from a strategic perspective, it's a very, very important place. And eventually the Venetians rule it, and that becomes a big part into what you see in Hania. So Hania, today, this is really modern day Hania. This was the Venetian fort. So you can see it adheres very much to the fort. You see the parapets here, each corner. This is the breakwater where the lighthouse is on. This is all there today. This is kind of the main drag is kind of right along here. We stayed up here. Incredibly charming town. Absolutely beautiful. This is the Airbnb we stayed at. The reason I bring that up is this thing kind of blew me away. This is actually a faucet of Cretan mountain water. So within the apartment, you had a faucet that basically gave you your own Cretan mountain water source. So once again, because of the mountains, as the water goes down and through the aquifer, it's purified. Incredible natural spring water. It was really neat to have that actually right in the Airbnb. This is the lighthouse, built in the 1500s. You know, those of us from New England, you know, our lighthouses are the 17 and 1800s. This is a couple hundred years before that. Sticks out into the harbor, basically creates the harbor. So you have this breakwater, very dramatic. You see remnants of the fort here, right at the entrance of the harbor. So it's an incredibly beautiful place. And once again, the side streets and everything else are just very quaint. You know, I'll say it was quiet. They do have, as I mentioned, a lot of olive trees. This is just a stock photo of, they put these agitators up in the trees to basically knock down the olives. And we were there in November. That is when the olives do ripen. So when you're walking around, particularly some of the places on the outskirts of the Acropolis, there's just olives everywhere in the sidewalk, smushed olives all over the place. This is a place that was actually right near a rental car place on Crete, and they lay down kind of tarps and they agitate the olives and they collect them into these tarps and take them away in trucks. I guess that's kind of the brute force way of doing it. There's lots of different levels, and I think it goes to the appellation of what your olive oil is like and how the olives are treated. This is kind of the brute force method to get the most bang for your buck. But it was pretty interesting to be there during the olive harvesting time there in late November. Once again, dramatic landscape, dramatic lighting, incredibly beautiful place. This is just one of the churches right down in downtown Hania. You can see just not too far away, the mountains really rise up. And so it's very dramatic as it goes down to the Mediterranean. And this is the first time I rented a car outside of North America. And it was not my first choice, but if you're going to visit Crete in November, you don't have much of a choice since there really aren't that many buses and it's a very big place. So being an American and not driving a stick, I had to get an automatic. I had to get a Suzuki Swift. I would not call it such a thing. It was not very swift, but it did get great gas mileage because as in most of Europe, gas is very expensive. It was $8 a gallon. And so about 200 miles of driving is about $42. I will say, I know my daughter was kind of freaked out. She had heard, you know, at the school she was working at, people said, oh, the people in Crete drive like crazy. And that is true. I will say, I said, people say, I go, it's like driving in Boston. I've driven in Boston for about 40 years. Except in 3 days, I saw basically every stupid thing I've seen in Boston in the last 40 years. It was because it's very congested. Like Hania, the downtown part is, you know, like every old town. This town's from, you know, 1500s. So the roads are very narrow. Parking is extremely difficult. And, you know, the motorbike is zipping everywhere. Definitely a challenge. Once you get on the major road, it's not really that difficult, except for the fact that people don't really seem to obey the speed limit. And so the courtesy is you kind of pull over halfway into the breakdown lane and let the person behind you passing you. And so our trip out to the Palace of Knossos, I spent most of the time getting past, but ended up being okay. Knossos was from 1900 BCE. So this is some seriously old stuff. These are models. This is a model of what the palace they think it looked like. It was multi-level, so you have a multi 2 to 3 level structure in 1900 BC, which is kind of crazy. So it is right kind of smack dab in the middle of the island. The legend around it is Theseus, who's the founder of Athens. He has to go to slay the Minotaur, which is in this labyrinth that was created by Daedalus and Icarus, with Icarus and his wax wings flying to the sky and crashing into the ocean. So he goes and slays a Minotaur and basically creates his legend. Unfortunately, one of the things was his father, who was back into what is today Athens, the signal was going to be if his boat came back with a black sail, it meant he failed in his Minotaur quest. If it came back on a white sail, it meant he was successful. Unfortunately, he was successful, but forgot to change the sail. And so he comes back and his father commits suicide when he sees the ship with the black sail coming. So that's another one of the talks and one of the legends in this. But it's a pretty amazing place. And we were there, like I said, this is one of the, most famous buildings in Western civilization. And we were there in mid to late, or actually it was late November, and there must have been 10 people there, if that. Um, so it's crazy. Now, what's also crazy is you go back to these archaeologists, this Arthur Evans, who excavates this, he gets the brilliant idea that he wants to actually paint what he thinks it should look like. So he does the excavation of these ruins and then goes to actually starting to paint them, which obviously anybody who's done archaeology in the last 50 years would just be absolutely flipping out. You would do something like this to desecrate it. But, the challenge is that this is what you're faced with, that there's not a lot of money here. This stuff has been buried for centuries, if not millennia. He's going to come in and he's going to fund the operation. So their hands are tied, and he is going to, wants to make some money off of it, make this as a visitor site and everything else. And so he gets the brilliant idea that, he's going to spice it up with what he thinks the color should be. So it is kind of weird, not very many, 4,000-year-old archaeological sites you go and you see the kind of color like this. This is actually the road that is at the Palace of Knossos. This is one of, if not the oldest road in Western civilization. It actually predates the Appian Way. So it starts with the Palace of Knossos. So it's an amazing location. It's an amazing location. It was amazing to be able to just wander around there, not having crowds, and bought an audio tour and were able to hear exactly all the stuff that went on. It's an incredible location. So as we leave Crete, I will say that the stop sign was in English. It was a mere suggestion of what a driver should do. So driving Heraclion in particular, which is a city that's associated with the Palace of Knossos, was a very, very stressful place to drive. And the stop sign, I had to kind of laugh, because when you see a stop sign, it's like, yeah, don't bet on that. But it's an amazing view, and you look out into the Aegean Sea, and you kind of want to pinch yourself. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. So we will end up back in Athens. We start to wrap up here. One thing we did was the Culinary Backstreets Tour, which is a food tour company that has various locations throughout the world. They do have one in Queens, is the closest we have here in Boston. But they're in a lot of food-centric cities like Palermo. I think they're in Lisbon. I want to say Barcelona. But my daughter had traveled to Istanbul, and she took a tour there and was just raving about it. So we took a tour of Athens, and it was hosted by the intrepid Constantine, who at one point in his life was a host on the Athenic version of MTV. So he had charisma to spare. And we must have been 6 or 7 hours wandering around Athens, tasting various things. And it sounds like you would just be like so weighed down with food. And it really wasn't that at all. I can't explain why that was the case. But it was phenomenal. And I will say the thing about Athens that I really didn't have much of an appreciation for is the food is phenomenal. It's cheap. It's expensive to get to Greece. It's a 10-hour flight. There's all that. But once you get into Greece, everything is pretty cheap. And the food in particular was cheap and incredibly well done. Incredibly well done. And so Constantine did a great job of, not just doing the food, but also just kind of, talking about life in Athens. And he's a lifelong Athenian and everything. And it was an amazing, amazing trip. So if you have a chance, I would strongly recommend that. But a little closer to home, you may or may not be aware, but the city of Lowell actually has had a rather large Greek population. And so as a result, there's actually a Greek pantry there, which I believe has an outlet in Belmont as well, called Sophia's. And it's in Market Street in Lowell. And I will say, not that I'm an authentic Greek person, but we went there, picked up some stuff, and I was like, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. So if you need a fix of quasi-authentic Greek stuff here stateside, I would highly recommend Sophia's in Lowell and in Belmont. So I mentioned about translating and Google Translate. Our Airbnb had a washer and dryer And I was surprised they actually were in Greek. I figured, like, who's making a market? Like, the market for Greek appliances must be pretty small. Look, thank God the car I drove, that was all in English. So the whole dashboard was all in English. My first thought, like, oh my gosh, this is in Greek, I'm really going to be in tough shape. But it wasn't. It was in English. However, our washer dryer was not. So I just thought this was kind of funny. We played the old Google Translate on it, or Microsoft has one as well, and it gives you an overlay of what all this means. And that's just kind of pumping, squeeze, pre-wash. You can kind of figure it out. Obviously, you have to get involved in some centigrade temperatures and everything. One thing I will say is that the wash cycles seem to be extremely long there, like hours long. But it was nice to have that availability there since we were staying there for a couple of weeks. And people talk about lack of air conditioning, and you see that obviously as the climate warms, you get more and more of these heat waves. Places like Paris and London are having real trouble because there's like no air conditioning at all. Athens has always been hot, has been noted as not having a great amount of air conditioning, but over the years they seem to have kind of adapted the whole heat pump thing. So not to get too much into the engineering and HVAC of things, but you have mini splits, which are interior units that can do heating and cooling, and they're pumped. They are sourced by outdoor heat pumps. And these are just some examples of taking pictures, random pictures of buildings in Athens, and the heat pumps are just everywhere. So the Airbnb we had did have a heat pump, did have mini splits, which probably in our two-bedroom apartment we had like four maybe. Each one has its own temperature control. So once again, for a place that is super, super hot in the summer, this must be a godsend because it is a very, very hot place. And they also have solar heaters, which once again, the sun shines in Athens a lot, over 300 days a year or something like that. So when you go up to the roof deck and the place we were staying, you can see these solar heaters, which were dotted everywhere. And so this is basically the hot water part. This is the solar panels. And like a lot of places, here in the United States, we don't really worry about turning off our hot water heater as much. There's all switches. And so they don't want you to really use your hot water heater until you're going to use it. So you turn it on about 10 minutes or so before you're going to use hot water, take a shower, play your shower, and turn it off. So much more energy efficient. Like I said, energy is very expensive over there. And I assume they're going to have more and more of the solar farms because there is, a lot of hills and a lot of sun in Greece. Toilet paper. This is something that's a little bit odd. You do have to, you cannot flush toilet paper in Greece. You have to put it into a little canister on the side, which is something I've never encountered before. But after some research, actually most of the world does not flush toilet paper. We're a little bit spoiled here in Western Europe and in Canada and United States and Australia. But you do have to do it that way. I guess the pipes are very, very small in Athens. The plumbing was done in the 1800s, and it's like, I think it's 2 inches wide, and the standard is 4 inches wide in the rest of Europe. So you have that. And you have cats. Everywhere you look, you have cats. There are wild, call them wild. They're not really all that wild. They're well fed. They're taken care of. People feed them. This guy particularly, we saw him multiple times, and he's your prototypical fat cat. This guy we see here, which was kind of interesting. This is right near where we stayed. And they say we went there in November, came back in April, and he was still hanging out in the scooter. And there's cats at the Palace Onassis. There's cats at the Parthenon. So there are cats everywhere. Supposedly keep down the rodent population. Supposedly mice are not a big problem in Athens, but they are everywhere. It is really, it's kind of cool. You have to really get used to it. So we will wrap up with the FulBright. Since I mentioned the reason we kind of ended up wandering over to Greece was my daughter was in a FulBright program, a FulBright fellow in Athens from August of 2022 to July of 2023. This is a quick minute or so video that gives you an overview of what the FulBright program is all about.
FulBright is
adventurous,
an incredible experience, a really key part of American diplomacy.
The true purpose of it is to create mutual understanding.
It's rigorous.
It's what you make of it.
FulBright is this incredible resource.
you don't know how much you're capable of until you're put in certain situations.
It gets you comfortable with the uncomfortable.
It really changes your identity. It gives you a new perspective.
I see it as like a chance to have a big adventure.
You embrace those hardships, you make it your own,
FulBright is an academic cultural exchange program.
It's for Americans doing study, research, or teaching English for roughly an academic year.
I did my Fulbright in a small Pacific Island country called Kiribati.
And I went to London,
To Malaysia,
Belgium.
Senegal,
Jordan,
Cambodia,
India,
Singapore.
The Galapagos in Ecuador.
When I went to Trinidad, my research focused on girls in a juvenile detention center.
Trying to fight hunger and malnutrition in Ethiopia.
studied high-speed aerodynamics at a small research laboratory outside of Brussels.
Focusing on trivalent chromium and type 2 diabetes.
Working with researchers to understand the impacts from plastic pollution.
taught 5th through 8th grade students conversational English.
The whole point of my project is to create empathy and understanding and respect for Kiribati people.
It's a life-changing experience.
It's not just your grant year. Fulbright is lifetime.
Fulbright is for everyone. So that means that Fulbright is also for you.
So that's the propaganda video for the Fulbright. This is kind of the time frame. Starts around February 1st. The application deadline in September. Letter of invitation in October. They have a peer review, in-country review, and they're notified the following January through May. So about 8,000 Fulbright grants awarded each year, 2,000 to U.S. students and 4,000 to foreign students coming to the U.S. In Greece, there were 193 applicants, only 12 were accepted. Greece is a very, very popular destination because there is not a language requirement. They realize that the only people who speak Greek outside of Greece are people who have Greek relatives. So that's not who their target audience is. So as a result, my daughter had to go through a pretty rigorous process and was fortunate to get in there. It was established in 1946, and 60 have won the Nobel Prize. So with that, this is our Fulbright heroine. She taught at a school here. She lived in Alandri, which is outside of Athens, and she taught at a Athens college, which is I think first grade to high school private school, and she taught elementary school students in English. It was a challenge. Within the first 4 days, her apartment was broken into, and her passport and her laptop were stolen. So she couldn't leave the country until she had her passport and her visa. And unfortunately, the visa was a one-time only thing. She had to get a higher level visa in order to get back there first to be able to travel outside the country. So she wasn't able to travel outside the country until I think November or December. But she persevered and had an amazing, amazing time there. And I'm very happy she did, and very happy we got some time to spend. We got to see her school. We got to see a Thanksgiving play. We were there over Thanksgiving, and they had put on a play. They were trying to give them an idea of what the U.S. holidays are like, and so we were able to see the play in person there, which is kind of a neat experience. So it was incredible. With that, there is no shortage of source material for Greece. I will mention these two here by Sofka Zinoviev. She is a writer who moved to Athens. I think she married a Greek gentleman and moved to Athens and then wrote a book about it. And then she actually wrote a novel based on, quite frankly, the Civil War aftermath and what happened, and all the, once again, the kind of family against family, the complexity of the communists versus the fascists and all this stuff. Really, really interesting, and gives it, a lot of immediacy by creating characters that are based in that space. And so I'd say from those are the two that really, from a modern Greek perspective, are really interesting. But there's no shortage. There's actually a local author based out of Concord, Henriette Lazaridis, who just wrote a book called Lost Days in Plaka, which came out this year actually, which is quite good. Gives you an idea of the kind of, once again, what it's going like as the country and the city of Athens, having growing pains, and they're having issues with things like Airbnb, where people can rent out an apartment for $150 a night, but the actual rent for a regular apartment is $600 a month. So people, native Athenians are being priced out of Athens. And so you have a lot of that kind of stuff going on. But once again, there's a lot of source material. Is Greek has been in our culture for the last couple of thousand years. There's no shortage of that. So with that, you can find me. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and on the web. And I'll be coming back in January to do another dramatic landscape, quite different than Greece, but no less interesting, Iceland. I'll be doing a presentation on Arctic Glow, a photographic journey through Iceland's midnight sun on January 21st at 7 p.m.
Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for a great presentation and sharing your beautiful photos. I hope to visit Greece someday. It's definitely on the bucket list. And I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. Again, please join us on January 21st for Arctic Glow, a photographer's journey through Iceland's midnight sun. And so with that, thank you, Bruce.
Thanks so much, Ellen. Thanks, everyone.